Hello, welcome everyone to the General Operating Support for Organizations application walkthrough. This is for our April 1st, 2024 deadline. My name is Todd Trebor. I am the Deputy Director at RISCA. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I manage the General Operating Support Program, as well as our Project Grants for Organizations program, as well as oversee all of our grant making at the agency. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce the program, talk about the program's goals, the eligibility requirements, the definition of underserved community-centered organizations, which is an evolution in language that I'll talk a bit about, funding rules and restrictions in this program, the ways in which it's best to approach starting your application, the evaluation criteria, and just some critical definitions for the program. And then I will actually walk through the application then. The majority of this, I'm going to go through the guidelines, but the guidelines will be key to understanding the application in the second half of this. And then I'll talk through also ways you can access more help with your applications. Make you all small again. All right, so the General Operating Support for Organizations program provides multi-year unrestricted operating support to arts and culture organizations and culturally specific organizations throughout Rhode Island that meaningfully engage and inspire their community through arts and culture programming. Organizations in this program make important contributions to the diversity and vitality of our communities, the economy of our state, and the enrichment of all Rhode Islanders and our quality of life. So the award amount for this program, it's formula-based. I'll get into depth about that later, but the awards range from $3,000 a year to $40,000 a year for 3 years. Organizations that can apply have to be 501c3 nonprofits or groups fiscally sponsored by 501c3 nonprofits based in Rhode Island. Organizations or fiscally sponsored groups must fit RISCA's definition of either being an arts and culture organization or a culturally specific organization with significant cultural programming. The deadline is, one second here, good, I can see a little bit. The deadline is April 1st, 2024. Organizations may apply to the program in the fiscal year in which they become eligible. If accepted into the program, they then reapply when the organizations in their budget cohort, which I'll talk more about what that word means, are up for reevaluation. So this cycle, the organizations up for reapplication are those with average annual budgets between $100,000 and $500,000 a year. Next year, April 1st, 2025, it will be those with budgets under 100,000. The following year, April 1st of 2026, where I will be rapidly approaching 50, they will be organizations with budgets over $500,000 a year. So getting into determining budget size, because that's the tricky thing, or one of the tricky things. So budget size for determining the application and grant awards will be based on the 3-year average of your organization's total cash expenses listed in your 990s from your 2020, 2021, and 2022 fiscal years. It's really important that it's those fiscal years, not necessarily those 990s. As you all know, 990s are labeled with a year on them, and that year indicates the year in which they are released. That doesn't necessarily always relate to your fiscal year. So just know for you all, it's going to be the total cash expenses listed on your 990s from your FY 20, 21, and 22. If your organization files a 990 EZ, your total cash expenses should be listed on the first page of your 990, Part 1, line 17. If your organization files a standard 990, your total cash expenses, should be listed on the first page of your 990, Part 1, line 18. If your organization's budget is under $50,000 a year, you're going to submit your 990N from your 2020, 2021, and 2022 fiscal years for compliance purposes. So these are both for determining award and also determining when you apply. It's also so we know you're a nonprofit in good standing with the federal and state government, right? If your organization is fiscally sponsored, you're going to submit your fiscal sponsors 990 from the 2022 fiscal year, again, for compliance purposes. The goals of this program. So this program was reevaluated and developed actually in 2020 by a 36-person working group representing arts and culture and culturally specific organizations from around the state of Rhode Island. The goals that this group came up with were one, that it would provide multi-year unrestricted operating support for arts and cultural organizations throughout the state through a competitive grant program. Two, that include organizations that are evaluated by a peer review panels as being responsive and accountable to the cultural needs of their identified communities. Three, and this one's a mouthful, that through extensive recruitment and a streamlined entrance process, the program would include organizations that better represent the diversity of the state along the following parameters. First one being racial representation. The goal was to have 10 BIPOC or ALANA-centered organizations. I'm going to define that term in a moment, but BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, or people of color, centered organizations in the program by 2025. Geographic, that there be 3 organizations from 3 different unrepresented towns or cities in the General Operating Support Program by 2025. The good news is we blew past those goals even in our first year. We went from 5 BIPOC or ALANA-centered organizations to 10, and then 11. And then we've reached 3 organizations from 3 unrepresented towns or cities. We're just going to keep on going and keep on keeping on, right? So you can see there the current list of unrepresented towns and cities in the program. Goal number 4, that the program would provide a just and equitable distribution of funding that helps address the damage done by generations of institutional racism. For this goal to be realized, additional funding consideration will be given to organizations that represent communities defined as underserved by the National Endowment for the Arts and their mission, programming, staff leadership, and board. This may include and does include, but is not limited to, BIPOC and ALANA communities, people with disabilities, or other communities who fit the NEA's definition of underserved. Getting to some eligibility things here. Eligibility, new applicants apply in the year in which they become eligible, as I mentioned before, and then reapply when their budget cohort is up for full reapplication. So we have some organizations this year with average annual budgets under $100,000 a year. Some of them are choosing to apply this deadline for the program. If they get in, they will have to reapply again next year. Some of them are choosing not to and just reapply and just applying for their first time next year. You have to be a nonprofit arts and culture or culturally specific organization. As I mentioned before, organizations can be fiscally sponsored if their annual budget is under $50,000 a year. If an organization's average annual budget is above $50,000 a year, they need to be their own standalone nonprofit. Semi-independent cultural entities that are either 1, associated with the university, or 2, a subdivision of a larger nonprofit can apply if they meet additional funding, additional eligibility criteria. They manage their own budget. They have at least 1 full-time individual who is an administrative staff person dedicated solely to the operation of that entity. And they have at least an advisory board that meets regularly to discuss policy, strategic direction, and resource development plans to ensure long-term sustainability of the organization or entity. They must have arts and culture stated as a central part of the organization's mission. And they must be in continuous operation and exhibiting or producing arts and culture programming for each year of the past 5 years. And they must present public programming in an ADA accessible space. Lastly, in order to be eligible, you have to obtain 3 GOSO eligibility points in 3 consecutive years. An organization gains an eligibility point by either 1, being awarded a project grant for organizations or a project grant in education within a given year, or 2, receiving an adjusted panel score of 83 or higher on a project grants for organization or education grant application. The second one is a head scratcher for people. The reason why we did that was to allow for the fact that our grant programs, particularly our project grant programs, are incredibly competitive. So we wanted to be more based on how a panel ranked a given application versus how much funding we had to give out in a given year. I'm the one who tracks that stuff. So if you apply for PGO or PGE and you don't get it, but you want to know if you have an eligibility point, just reach out to me. Underserved community-centered organizations, I'm going to get into that definition now, and also definitions for BIPOC and ALANA, which I mentioned before. So you all might remember that the language was slightly different in previous cycles. We needed to align the language regarding our funding formula to hew more closely to the National Endowment for the Arts and their definitions for underserved communities, since that is our justification for our funding formula and how it operates. The National Endowment for the Arts defines underserved communities as ones in which individuals lack access to arts programs due to geography, economic conditions, ethnic background, or disability. This definition may include BIPOC and ALANA communities, people with disabilities, immigrant groups, rural populations, aging populations, people living in poverty, people experiencing houselessness, incarcerated populations, communities recovering from trauma or disaster, and military service members and veterans. Please note that in accordance with the National Endowment for the Arts definition, age alone does not qualify a community as underserved. It can be age in combination with another factor, geography, economic conditions, ethnic background, and or disability. Definition of ALANA, since I've been using that a few times, undefined. We've changed the agency using descriptors to describe racialized communities to include BIPOC and ALANA, because we've found that that reflects diversity of community preference. So the acronym for ALANA means, this acronym is for Asian, Latina, or Latino, Latinx, or Latine, African, Arab, and Native American, intended to be inclusive of any individual culture, community, or arts organizations from these racial and ethnic identity groups. The term intentionally names these broad racial and ethnic identities rather than the grouping them under the more generic term people of color. And definition of BIPOC, which again, there's some people in our community that prefer that term, is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. The term is meant to unite all people of color while acknowledging that Black and Indigenous people face different and often more severe forms of racial oppression and cultural erasure as consequences of systemic white supremacy and colonialism. Underserved community-centered organization. So an underserved community-centered organization is an organization, excuse me, everyone, that is explicitly an organization with a mission and programming that is explicitly reflective of a community defined as underserved by the NEA, and where the board, staff, artists, and collaborators include a significant representation of that community. A underserved community-centered organization is defined by the following organizational characteristics. Their primary mission, intentions, and practices are by, for, about, and about the art, heritages, histories, and cultures of a particular underserved community. Their executive leader identifies as a member of the underserved community who is the focus of the organization's mission. The board is at least 60% individuals who identify as members of the underserved community who is the focus of the organization's mission. And the staff similarly is 60% individuals who identify as members of the underserved community who is the focus of an organization's mission. I'm going to pause really quick in case you all have questions right now. 1 second. Oops. All right, funding rules and restrictions. So that section leads us into the section where those terms really come into play significantly. So for applicants applying or reapplying at the deadline for their budget cohort, quote unquote, an on-year application or applicant, grant awards will be determined by the following factors. The panel's ranking and their funding recommendations, an organization's annual operating budget. Again, I just went through how we calculate your average annual operating budget. If the organization has an annual average budget of under $1 million and fits RISCA's definition of being an underserved community-centered organization. And lastly, the amount of funds allocated for organizational support by the council. So this is our funding formula here. You can see, again, it is budget-based. And depending on your organization's average annual budget, that qualifies you for an award within a given range. The most typical award an organization will receive is the middle award you see there, and I'll get into the reasoning behind all that. When a panel, and I'll talk about the panel a little bit later, reviews applications, they pre-score applications, they meet for a full panel day on Zoom, and then they're able to adjust their scores for each application privately based on the discussions that they have. At the end of the panel day, I'm going to show them a spreadsheet that has all the applicants ranked in descending order based on score. High scoring applications at the top, low scoring applications at the bottom. I mentioned budget cohort before. Remember I said that the organizations with average annual budgets between $100,000 and $500,000 a year are up for reapplication. That's the budget cohort, but there's two budget classes, as you will see, $100,000 to $250,000 and $250,000 to $500,000. Looking at their rankings, the panel can recommend an applicant that scores high in a given budget class, the highest award possible in the award range. So looking at the $100,000 to $250,000 a year organizations, they could recommend the highest scoring application in that budget class for an award of $9,000, which you can see is the top award increment. If they do so, then they need to recommend the lowest scoring organization in a budget class receive the lowest award possible, $5,000. This is because we've had a hold even grants budget for a really long time. And the only way to make a funding formula that fit the desires and wishes of the community working group that was competitive, that incentivized high scoring organizations that to some degree did some level of flattening of the ways in which budget is taken into an account for determining grant award was to do it this way. If you recommend someone for an increase, you have to recommend someone for a decrease. What is typically the case is most organizations receive, again, that middle award. It's only the high scoring organization, maybe one or two, that receive the high award. The low scoring organizations, maybe one or two, that receive the low award. A panel can also choose not to do that at all and give everyone the middle award associated with their budget class. In line with VRSCA's strategic plan and with the goals of this program, additional funding consideration will be given to organizations with average annual budgets under $1 million that fit VRSCA's definition of being an underserved community-centered organization, including BIPOC and ALANA-centered organizations. For organizations that fit these criteria, panels may recommend them for a limited number of available grant awards that are 1.5 times larger. So for organizations that fit that definition, then a panel feels should receive an award, this is the funding scheme that applies to them. So again, you can see that it's 1.5 times larger. Same issues apply in the sense that they're going to be grouped with the other organizations in their budget cohort. But if it happens that one of the top scoring, organizations of their budget class, but if they happen to be the top scoring organization in their budget class, which has happened, then they will get a higher than usual, than the standard grant award. At least that's possible. Again, there's a limited number of them, but it's possible. For newly eligible organizations awarded a general operating support grant in an off year, the grant program will not follow the regular funding scheme. Instead, it's going to be based on availability of funds, but will be at least $4,000. The organization then has to reapply, I should say, with the rest of their budget cohort. This is the example I mentioned earlier in the presentation. If there's a couple organizations with budgets under $100,000 a year who might apply this year. If they do so and get in, they have to reapply again next year. And that's actually a better case for them because then, as you can imagine, they're going after a larger pool of funds versus a very small pool of funds we might have to let in new organizations. There are some years where we might not be able to let in new organizations, and I tell applicants that ahead of time. Yeah, if they don't receive a grant, they are welcome to apply again in an on year. Panel. I've been mentioning the panel a little bit. So panels, the panel for the General Operating Support Program is comprised of 5 individuals. 3 of them are from out-of-state and 2 from in-state. For those of you aware of VRSCA's grant programs, typically we recruit all of our panelists from in-state with the exception of a few of our grant programs where we have out-of-state panelists as well. You can imagine for general operating support, it is incredibly difficult to find people who fit the criteria of understanding what it means to operate an organization that's of the size being evaluated in the given on year without there being a conflict of interest. So that's where we have a fair number of out-of-state panelists. Individuals, we recruit with diversity along a number of metrics, gender, race, ethnicity, geography, to when we think about in-state. arts and culture, discipline, expertise, or knowledge. We also, with general operating support, consider individuals who work at organizations, like I just said, of similar size and ilk that are from other states. Or if they're from within the state, maybe they're in a arts and culture adjacent subsector, humanities, etc. Also, for out-of-state panelists, we often get individuals who work at state or local arts agencies, so folks like me, or have a similar vantage point of the arts and culture ecosystem nationally, and it can bring that outsider perspective in there. So part of the beauty of the panel process for general operating support is a dialogue between people who are from the state of Rhode Island and work here, and those from out of state. All panelists, because I don't think I said this on a future slide, that are from out of state receive an orientation to Rhode Island and its beauties and its idiosyncrasies. They receive a few resources from me as well, in addition to having a conversation with me just explicitly about that. More funding rules and restrictions. You're ineligible to apply for or receive funding from any other RISCA grant program when you're in general operating support, and that should just be something you all are aware of. The beauty of being in general operating support is the grant awards are larger than most of our other project grant programs. You only have to submit one application every 3 years. So that's pretty great. There are some exceptions there. Our Culture Facilities Fund, when we have one active and available, general operating support recipients are welcome to apply to. And there's some other special programs we've had in the past, supported by American Rescue Plan Act funds, for instance, that general operating support organizations have been able to apply to as well. General operating support recipients may function as fiscal sponsors for other Arts Council grant applicants or partners on projects with other Arts Council applicants as well. You can even be a fiscal sponsor for another organization that's applying for general operating support. Fiscal sponsors, we view them as just pass-throughs. It's a requirement from the federal government that the money go to nonprofits, but we obviously are most interested in ensuring that we're supporting relevant community programs and organizations, right, regardless of their nonprofit status. You must credit risk on all marketing materials. If you do a program book, we ask that you include a program ad that we have available on our website. And you must inform us of any substantive changes to your organization's mission, scope of programming, or organizational structure. For example, if you decide you're closing, that's a really great one to tell me as soon as you're able to, because as you can imagine, that's important for us to know. Allowable expenses. This is great, can be used for general operating expenses, which is obviously the difficult thing to get funding for, salaries, rent, and utilities. Any program activity just has to be, must take place in Rhode Island if it's using these funds to support it. So not touring things, for example. Not allowable expenses, this is a much longer list that many of you are familiar with because it is from the federal government. It's something that's a part of 98% of our grant programs. You can't use grant funding for capital projects in this program, development efforts, eliminating debt, or making contributions to an endowment fund, purchasing food, beverages, or alcohol, prizes or awards, re-granting, anything associated with graduate, undergraduate degree programs, proselytizing or promoting religious activities, programming happening in spaces that are inaccessible to people with disabilities, and expenses occurred or activity occurring outside of the award period. I'm going to pause recording again, if it will come up. See if you'll have any questions, because I know it's a lot coming at you. Starting your application, the thing is that you will want to gather. I always tell people, both general operating support applicants and project grant applicants, the first thing you're going to want to gather is all the paperwork stuff, because that's the things that people run around at the last minute being like, oh my God, where is it? So your 501c3 determination letter, your SAM UEI number, your FY20, FY21, and FY22 990s, and a board-approved budget from your current or most recently completed fiscal year can be provided in whatever format works for your organization. We're requesting this for compliance purposes. So we intentionally do not ask for FY23 990s because everyone has different fiscal years, right? And there might be some folks that are still working on their 990 for FY23, but you all can submit and will submit some kind of board-approved budget for that fiscal year. Support materials. Again, this is the thing I tell people, get them now, get them early. Things from the last 3 years. In this case, there's two kinds. There's one's related to your organization, organizational support materials, and one related to the community. So support materials from the last 3 years that show how your organization is meaningful to your communities or community. There should be anything in the voice of community members outside of your organization, audience members, partner businesses, students, clients, but just not board staff or employed artists. People, again, in the external community, external to your organization's people who have a conflict of interest there, again, staff, board, etc. Examples include letter of support from community partners, community members, a document of quotes from current program participants, etc. Other set of support materials you'll gather, you can have up to 4 of that one, and up to 4 of these, which are the ones that are organizational support materials that show your artistic or cultural programming. One thing I'll say about this, since for many of you this is old hat, you'll want to be sure you're submitting them in the format that our system can read and that panelists can read. So for videos, include links, or for audio, include links from an external platform, third-party platform like Vimeo, YouTube, etc. For other things, we're not able to read pages or numbers formats, so just be aware of that. PDFs are a great way to go, or anything from the Microsoft Suite or Google Suite or whatever. A current list of your board members. If you're using a fiscal sponsor, this will be your advisory board or committee guiding your organization's work. This is true for organizations that are a subdivision of another nonprofit. And then a board and staff demographics chart that's available within the general operating support application. Evaluation criteria and definitions. One moment. I'm going to show you all the rubric in a little bit just so you understand how it's laid out. The evaluation rubric is also within the grant application and on our website as well. We always recommend that people read through their application with the rubric. What you will see with general operating support, this is actually, in my opinion, a much easier application than project grants for organizations, because either you're doing the things or you're not doing the things, and that should kind of be how it is, right? Half of the score is artistic vibrancy and relevancy. So is there evidence that the organization meaningfully engages and inspires its community through arts and culture to achieve its mission? Sub-criteria here that core programming is strongly related to the organization's mission and their defined organizational community, that they demonstrate a complete and thorough understanding of their geographic community their organization is based and largely programs in. Organizational community and geographic community, I'm going to define those in a little bit. Wanted to say also, I did not define arts and culture organization and culturally specific organization. Didn't want to bombard you with too many definitions. There is a glossary within the application as well as the guidelines as well. I just wanted to define the terms that are going to be most relevant to the information I'm communicating with you today. Third, fourth, and fifth sub-criteria, able to clearly articulate who the audience or communities they engage with through their programming are and indicating data or information sources, and explains how who they engage relates to their mission. Needs, desires, and/or identities of their organizational community are reflected in the organization's artistic and cultural programming. And community support materials come from a varied array of community sectors, both arts and non-arts, and reflect a robust support for the organization. Again, that's where those community support materials come in, being in the voices of others. Organizational responsiveness and ingenuity. This is 30% of your score. The guiding question here, is there evidence that the organization effectively operates in dialogue with their defined organizational community with leadership reflective of that community? Sub-criteria, organization has a board that's reflective of their organizational community and its diversity, and is proactively engaged in efforts to ensure that it's sustained. The needs of their organizational community are reflected in their operations. For example, board and staff decision-making, policy development, planning, or evaluation. And they've worked in dialogue with their organizational community to negotiate a recent challenge. Lastly, 20% of the score is commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Guiding question here, is there evidence the organization is reflecting their stated DEIA goals through organizational representation and meaningful actions? Sub-criteria here, representation of staff at a variety of levels, artists and key collaborators that include those in their organizational community who come from underserved communities in both their public-facing programming and administrative work. They're engaging in meaningful actions to ensure representation within from underserved communities that is commensurate with where they are at in those efforts, as well as their staff size and resources. And lastly, example actions shared are substantive and reflect the organization's DEIA goals or priorities. Again, those definitions of organizational community and geographic community, we're going to see these again when we walk through the application in a moment. Organizational community are the people who comprise the audiences or communities your organization engages through their programming. This should include audience members, artists, students, and others, other groups that are significant to your organization. Descriptions of the community could include demographic and geographic makeup, including information about relevant socioeconomic factors, as well as diversity of age, ethnicity, race, gender, ability, and education. I'll say this now, and I might repeat it again when we look at the application, that it's great if you can include demographic information, et cetera. That's easier done for some organizations, given the kind of work they do, such as many of our creative youth development organizations. For others, it's a bit more challenging. You're just going to want to relate your assessment of your organizational community to what information you have and be clear what information you have that is informing that. Definition of geographic community, the people who live in the place, which could be a neighborhood, town, or city in which your organization is physically located, as well as the geography and character of the place. If your organization doesn't have a physical location, this would be the place in which you most frequently offer programming. Descriptions of the people in the community could include demographic and geographic makeup, including information about relevant socioeconomic factors, et cetera, diversity of age, ethnicity, race, gender, ability, education. Descriptions of geography and character could include discussion of relevant history or physical features that define the community, such as rivers or streets, or community institutions and resources, and density, being an urban versus a rural community. Again, you're going to have half your panelists, more or less, that are from Rhode Island. As we know, there are many people who live in Rhode Island who don't necessarily have a lot of familiarity with other communities in Rhode Island. So that can't be guaranteed. That's where we become helpful. And then you have another half that's going to be from out of state. So speaking to that audience is really important here to give them that context. We talk a lot about organizational community in this application and some about geographic community. The understanding is that your geographic community might be different from your organizational community. Some folks have a really clear overlap. They're like, we serve 02909 and that's where we're based. That's where our audience comes from. That's where our board comes from, our staff, et cetera. For some organizations, it's a little bit more complicated, so which is why we allow for those two distinctions. All right, I'm going to pause one more time for questions before we look at the application. All right, big moment. We're going to actually look at the application. So for you all to know, again, if you are eligible to apply this cycle, you've heard from me already. One of the things I gave you was an access code that you'll have to enter in order to access the application, since its accessibility is restricted to eligible organizations. I'm using a, a dummy profile, the Amelia Canor Theater Company. My dog is named Amelia. That's why it was called that. So I'm going to enter the access code in here just so you can see it goes up there at the top of there. So what you'll do is you all have profiles in the grant system already. You'll log in. For those of you who have received grants from us before, which I think is everyone who's eligible for general operating support, now that I'm saying that out loud, you're actually not going to see this as your landing screen. What you're going to want to do is click on apply up there. That'll take you to the list of grant options available. You're then going to enter the access code. And that will bring up the application. You then just hit apply. And this takes you to the application. Start of it is just application overview. There's different sections to this application. We're really clear about the distinctions between them. So before you start the application, it's just an eligibility quiz. We also indicate what is the information for the panel that the panel will see, and what is the information for RISCA staff that is for us to collect for eligibility purposes and determining funding, formula stuff, etc. Also, second section here, guidelines and template forms. We have a copy of the guidelines there, the board and staff demographic charts that I will show you later. I'll show you an example of one later that is a part of this application, and then the evaluation rubric, which I will also show you as well. At the top, as well, is our glossary. So I went over many of these terms already. Arts and cultural organizations is one I did not. Alana, BIPOC Alana centered organizations. I will just mention culturally specific organizations really quickly. A culturally specific organization is one that serves a particular cultural community and is founded, led by, and staffed with people who are members of that community. These nonprofits, community-based groups help people thrive by starting on a foundation of shared cultural identities, histories, languages, and experiences. Often beginning as grassroots efforts, these organizations remain embedded in the fabric of the communities as they grow. We support culturally specific organizations that have significant cultural programming. For example, many of you are aware of these probably, Oasis International, India Association of Rhode Island, I'm blanking on some others right now. Many of these organizations are alumni of the Rhode Island Expansion Arts Program. Tamaqua Museum is an example of one as well, although they kind of straddle both definitions. So then the eligibility quiz, you're going to enter in the total cash expenses from your 990s and then provide me with the average. I will double check you on all that, so don't worry. You'll then identify if you're an arts and culture or culturally specific organization, that you're a nonprofit. If you're not, there will be a branching question that comes up that will ask you information about your fiscal sponsor, ADA compliance, and being operating for 5 years. At the top of the information for the panel, we talk about the General Operating Support Panel and how it's developed, or recruited. One thing I forgot to mention altogether is, as an agency, we have a commitment that 2 panel members for all of our 5-person panels will be BIPOC or Alana identifying individuals. And at least one of them will also be a practicing artist. So a lot of metrics to hit, but we always hit it. So first information is just very introductory. Your organization, excuse me, this all, come on, great. Your organization's mission. Remember, you're going to relate mission to organizational community. You might remember that from a sub-criteria I showed you before. You're going to summarize your organization's core programs and infrastructure to give the panel context about what your organization is and what your organization does. The staffing structure is important because it relates to the board and staff demographic sheet, but also so panelists understand just what kind of infrastructure resources your organization has. You then can submit, you might remember, those organizational support materials that show your artistic or cultural programming. There's up to 4 of those materials available to submit. You can see, and I think I glossed over this, in introducing your organization, you can provide that snapshot of staffing structure, how many folks you employ, etc. You can also, and this is totally optional, include an organizational chart, either to complement your narrative description of your organization, or in lieu of doing that, if you want to save some character space. We know these things are complicated to articulate in a narrative, so sometimes having something visual is an easier way to go. Your geographic community. Remember, I was talking about this. In this question, you're going to describe the community your organization is located in. If your organization does not have a physical location, you'll describe the community in which your organization most regularly programs. That's to kind of, again, center your organization in a place. Your organizational community is the people who are your audiences or communities your organization engages with through your programming. So you're going to want to talk about that here, and also how this connects to your organization's mission and what data sources inform your understanding of who your audiences or your communities are. Ticket sales, you can see there, registration information, observation, right? Responsiveness to your organization in your programming and then in your operations. So 2 sister questions or sibling questions. How are the needs, desires, or identities of your organizational community reflected in your artistic and cultural programming? You can include, if relevant, how your organizational community is included in your decision-making about programming. An ideal response length is 2 to 3 paragraphs. You will see throughout this, we've indicated ideal response length, but we've made the character count high enough to account for that response length with some space. So really try to stick to that ideal response length as my recommendation. Goldilocks, right? You don't want to say too little, don't want to say too much. This panel is going to be reviewing, for context for you all, anywhere between 22 and 25 applications. So you want to give them the right amount of information, and we feel that these response lengths will kind of help with that. Responsiveness to your organization and community, your organizational community and operations. So how is their needs reflected in your operational decision-making? You can speak about board and or staff decision-making processes, policies, evaluation or planning, etc. How your organization negotiates challenges. This used to be challenges or opportunities, but we got feedback from multiple panels that they found the responses to this much more interesting, hearing about a challenge that an organization had. And often an opportunity and challenge are the flip side of the same coin, right? We also removed, some of you might remember, a question about how the pandemic has impacted your organization, understanding that this might be a space to talk about that, right? About that being a challenge you faced. And then you're going to submit support materials, up to 4 of them, that show how your work of your organization is meaningful to your organizational and geographic community. Again, these are things that are in the voice of community members, right? If you have letters of support and you have, let's say, 4 of them, or let's say more than that, you get 6. I recommend that, because letters of support tend to be fairly cookie cutter, fairly formulaic, which is fine. You can include up to 3 in a file upload, because usually that's about 3 or 4 pages. That's information a panel can take up pretty easily. You know, they're going to be looking for highlights in those letters and then who it is that submitted the letter, right? Your board. So how your board is reflective or not reflective of your defined organizational community and its diversity, and if relevant, what efforts your organization is engaging in to ensure your board is or will be reflective of its organizational community. 1 to 3 paragraphs length there. Board and staff demographic grid, I'll get into in a moment, because I have to shut things down and share that with you differently. We're permitted by the NEA to ask about board members and their race and ethnicity based on very specific language that you can see within there. We leave it there in the grid. If you want to talk, if you were able to and want to talk about staff and artists, etc., with those same demographics, you're welcome to. It's all about what information you have that can display how your organization reflects its organizational community in its board. All the fields are editable. So if you want to change the racial descriptors to better suit your community, that's fine. If you want to add additional ones, you're welcome to do that as well. For instance, we've had organizations that are disability centered that work primarily with communities with disabilities that obviously make incredibly strong efforts to have people with disabilities on their board, reflecting their organizational community. So some folks have chosen to add that field to their board and staff demographic sheet. Similarly, with organizations that might serve the or engage the LGBTQIA plus community. Question 12, diversity in staff, artists, and volunteers. So you discuss here how you're achieving or addressing diversity amongst your staff, if any, artists and volunteers, and ensure representation from those from underserved communities within your organizational community, which is a really important point. What underserved means is place-specific and dependent. What it means to be a member of an underserved community in Burrillville is going to be different than it is in Central Falls. And that's something that we orient the panel to, and it's something that you will orient them to as well when you're defining your geographic community and your organizational community. And then lastly, commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Very tactical here. 3 ways your organization has prioritized DEIA for short in your programming and operations, and why those actions were taken. There's definitions for diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in our glossary for the application. Lastly, we have a DEIA planning document that's an optional upload. If you have something from your strategic planning process, you can share that here. If you have a racial equity or DIA plan, you can share that here. You can also use this as a space to articulate things you can articulate in question 13 if you don't have such a document, fully fleshed out through one of those processes. You just want to be honest about what it is. And then the rest of this is just eligibility documents I mentioned before, SAM-UEI, your various 990s, indicating whether or not you believe your organization fits a definition of an underserved community-centered organization. Please be sure about it, meaning like look at the requirements there. If you check this, it will then pull up a branching question that will ask what community. Obviously, the most common in Rhode Island is organizations that are BIPOC and Latina centered, which is why we highlight that. And then just some federal and state data questions that you all are familiar with. Very, very exciting. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to pause recording and stop sharing. You can feel free to ask me questions about this while I'm doing that. And I'm going to pull up both the rubric. I'm going to pull up the board and staff demographic grid first, and then I'll show you the rubric last. So this is the board and staff demographics grid that I mentioned before. You can see that as I mentioned, there's instructions there. We can only ask these federally defined demographic fields, and we can only require it for board members. Everyone else, it's whatever you feel comfortable presenting, whatever information you feel you have. We've also defined, before I get into that, again, those something else rows, all of this is editable. You can edit this whatever way you want, and you can add different things if it's relevant to your organization. For some organizations, it's very, very relevant to talk about gender, for instance. We define for you all, just to help you all out, because we're trying to make distinctions with staff with a variety of organizations, what we mean when we say executive level, what we mean when we say management or mid-level, what we mean when we say other staff, independent contractors, volunteers. We have a definition for practicing artists as well. So be sure to read those instructions, because some people look at this and they're like, oh my God, I don't have mid-level management staff. We've tailored that definition to be specific to this category or group of organizations based on conversations with you all about what would be the best way to collect this information. Lastly, the rubric. I'm not going to go into wild depth about this, but I just wanted you all to see it. One of the things that I did for you all and our panelists, because it actually came primarily as a panelist request, was indicate what sub-criteria related to what question. The big thing to note is that the panel is scoring you on a score between 1 and 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, for each of those criteria. And you can see it's fairly broad in terms of how we determine numbers. We've noticed over time as we've experimented with the rubrics that this was the best way to go. We've also seen that colleagues in the field have found this is the best way to go. Allowing panelists to make their own number determinations based on these very broad guideposts. And we have found again that this makes it so they're adhering to the evaluation criteria that we all have developed collectively in this program, and B, that they're consistent with themselves across applications. For any of you who have been panelists before, that is one of the trickiest things to do, is to be evaluating application number 1 you look at with the same equivalency as application number 20. And as we've all experienced who have done this before, sometimes you go back and forth a bit to make sure you're being true to yourself. All right, and again, this is linked in the application as well. And that is it. We're right on time. I can stay here for a few more minutes if you like, if anyone has any questions. But if you need to go on your merry way, go on your merry way. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Adrienne, for also being my face to look at sometimes. Have a great rest of your morning and great week if I don't talk to you in the next couple minutes. I'm going to stop recording now. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye, y'all.